dus moet ik hier ipo.
Just ask there for a mic. Stand here.
Okay. Did you already? He's in the, let me see, I said this.
See, because I messaged him, let's see if he's there. Meeting ko lagi kana ko yung mic din sumay.
Bonucci. This is too far. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Jim Randall. I'm the chair of the conference planning committee for this conference, and it's a pleasure to be here in Aruba. It's my second visit in a span of only 3 months. So if I come back every 3 months, maybe I'll get one of those awards after 10 years, right? I just wanted to make a couple of comments before I turn it over to my colleague who will introduce the keynote speaker for tonight. One is that this session is being live streamed, and because it's being live streamed, if you wouldn't mind setting your cell phones to silent or vibrate, we'd appreciate it. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Laurie Brinklow from the University of Prince Edward Island, who will introduce the keynote speaker for tonight.
Good evening, Governor, conference delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be here in Aruba, my first time, not my last, that's for sure. And I am just absolutely delighted to be introducing one of my dearest friends, Godfrey Baldacchino. I was joking with Simran Singh today that saying how long we had known him, and he said, well, I've known him, since 2002. And I said, well, I've known him since 1992, which is probably longer than you were born. Actually, probably not, but it felt like it. So we hosted in 1992 in Prince Edward Island a conference called An Island Living. And actually Carlos was there too. So Carlos has known him since 1992 as well. Anybody known him longer? Yes, we win the prize. It was a wonderful conference, and it was one of those magical moments when we knew that we were onto something with island studies. From the time that we picked up the delegates at the airplane till the time we dropped them off, they talked. And it's the same with this conference. It's amazing. You are all talking, and I know that when we leave tomorrow and Saturday and Sunday, you'll still be talking. And that's what it means to be part of the Island Studies family, because that's what you are now. Welcome. In 2013, we were very lucky to attract Godfrey to become the first Canada Research Chair in Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island. And that's when we launched our Master of Arts in Island Studies program, and I was in the first cohort. So Godfrey was my first professor of Island Studies, and he's since become a mentor, an inspiration, and a very good friend. In fact, he is one of the most prolific Island Studies scholars on the planet, what we would call a rock star in layman's terms. He is our Island Studies rock star. He's published close to 50 books and over 100 peer-review articles. He founded Island Studies Journal, which also is a peer-reviewed journal. It is an amazing journal filled with Island Studies material, and if you're ever looking for something, that's your first go-to place for Island Studies material. Thank you, Godfrey, for doing that. In 2013, he and his wife Anna moved back to Malta. I think the winters got too much for them. I don't blame them. He is now a professor of sociology and the pro-rector for international development at the University of Malta. He's now founded a new journal called the Small States and Territories Journal, of which he is the executive editor. He's also the president of the International Island Studies Association, a member of RETI, which is another university organization for islands, and he is the co-holder of the UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability with Dr. Jim Randall. As I said, he's one of the best lecturers and teachers because of his vast knowledge of his subject material, his superlative analytical skills, and a passion for islands that he instills in others, including me. So tonight, you're in for a treat. Please help me welcome Godfrey Baldacchino.
Well, that was a splendid introduction. Let's try to live up to it now. Your Excellency, Rector, Conference Chair, colleagues, distinguished guests. All right, it's a great pleasure to be here today, addressing the conference theme in a somewhat different manner, however, from what we have been used to for the past couple of days. We have been supposedly addressing island stories. However, the stories that we have been addressing have been really about the islands, not about the islanders. So I'm trying to do something a bit different this evening. I'm trying to look at the issues from the ground up. So the methodology is somewhat different. It's not exotic. It's not new. I'm not doing anything new tonight. Moreover, I hardly know anything about Aruba. So unlike, for example, Jim, who's been here already, this is his second visit. This is my first visit. So, of course, I'm not going to say anything about your island, but perhaps I am. I'm not sure. You'll be the judge of that. This is the power of island studies. You start talking about other places, and then at the back of your mind you say, this might apply to mine as well. So how to start this conversation this evening? I'm sure you've been hooked by the title. It's a slight adaptation of a very famous line from a Beatles song. Woke up, got out of bed, dragged the comb across my head. You know the song? Do you know the name of the song? A Day in the Life. It's a day in the life. There's nothing special going on. This is about a guy who wakes up in the morning, makes the bus just in time. You know, he grabs a coffee, he goes into a daydream, he reads the news on the paper. It's any other day. Nothing special. So how do people on small islands behave? How do they behave in between hurricanes, in between disasters? Presumably for the bulk of their lives. This is what I'll be trying to talk about. So I'm going to take you first to another island, at another place, at another time. For the Italians in the room, Michele, you might know what I'm going to talk about here. There are two characters in this tragedy, two main characters. One is the mayor of a very small island called Giglio on the west coast of Italy. His name is Sergio Ortelli. He is the mayor of an island of 1,600 people, or as the Canadians would say, 1,600 people. It means the same thing. The other character in this play, the villain of the piece, if you will, is a ship captain. His name is Francesco Schettino. And he is the captain of a cruise ship, the Costa Concordia. And the cruise ship is carrying along 3,200 passengers, or as the Canadians would say, 3,200 passengers, on a cruise of the Mediterranean Sea. And this captain, for some reason, some people claim that he had a dare, he decided to navigate extremely close to this island called Giglio, with the result that the cruise ship was beached and turned over. It hit rocks and keeled over. There was a rescue operation, but as a consequence of that episode, 32 people lost their lives. And for a time, people didn't want to go on cruise ships. But this is history now. The event unfolded on Friday the 13th, 2012. And one of the strange things going on in that particular night is that the captain of the ship was one of the first persons to leave his ship. Not the last. He was one of the first persons to leave his ship. He was terrified. And as he was crossing over from the cruise ship to the island, the mayor of the island was doing exactly the opposite. He grabbed a boat and was going to try and save as many passengers as possible from this cruise ship. It's an irony, right? How things turn up. This is life. Now, why am I saying all this? Because that was the night that everybody got to know about this island, Giglio. And guess what? It's been forgotten. ever since. It made the headlines on that particular day. The mayor was the hero for a night, perhaps for two, perhaps for three. And then gradually, as always happens with the news, it got overtaken by other events, got lost. And it takes a professor every now and then at an islands conference to remind people about this. This island still exists. People are still there. They're still living. They're still doing things. They're not necessarily playing heroes all the time, of course, but they are living. And I'd like us to remind ourselves, right, that island life is not just about dramatic episodes. Of course, dramatic episodes are important. It's important to discuss how people respond to hurricanes, to catastrophes, to earthquakes. But they also respond to job opportunities, educational opportunities, health issues. And this is what I'd like to talk to you about today. And I will start with a familiar sight, certainly to the people of Aruba. Thailand. I am told that every August there is a special flight, or more than one, that takes your children to go and start on a new life, on a new adventure in the motherland. Students who are on scholarship, perhaps, students who have been accepted in universities, particularly in the Netherlands, of course. And this is one of the visible aspects of the link between this Caribbean island and the relatively small European country. Now, of course, Holland is not exactly a very small country. By Caribbean standards, it would be one of the largest, right? Only Cuba, I believe, would have a population larger than the Netherlands in the Caribbean. By European standards, it's a different story. But at least Holland takes pride in being one of the largest countries among the smallest ones in the EU, for example. 16 million people is not bad. And of course, I'm coming from the smallest member of the European Union, so I think I can say that. So I'm using this slide as a reflection, a symbol of some of the connectivities that are at the heart of the relationships between what we are calling subnational island jurisdictions, overseas territories, if you will, partially independent countries, if you will, non-independent states, if you will. You know, these are different nomenclatures for the same thing. And their motherland, or their fatherland. The place that would have been perhaps their colonial master in the past. Now terminology has changed, relationships have changed, and they will continue to change. This is a work in progress. And people, typically, of course, they grumble. They want to see better things. It's our nature. So while they have a status, they will also linger and discuss the status and think about how better can it be? And if so, in what way? How can we improve our status? Do we improve it by becoming independent? Perhaps. Do we improve it by deepening integration? Perhaps. Do we develop better links with other islands in the stream? Next door, perhaps? Who knows? These are some of the issues that I think we should keep in mind. So as I said earlier, I'm trying to do something a little bit different this evening. Most of the presentations that we heard over the past couple of days, and presumably tomorrow, have adopted the rather macro or meso approach. So it's either discussing the island as a whole, as a jurisdiction, as a territory, or discussing institutions, the meso level, the political architecture, the economic structure, the social fabric, as mediated by politics, of course. Politics and part and parcel cannot be avoided, very, very difficult to avoid in small jurisdictions, as I will also elaborate soon. Possibly also, understandably, in terms of game theory. So you need to, in politics, you need not just to think about the outcome of your actions, you also need to think about the outcome of your actions. Like a game of chess, right? So ideally you are a step ahead, or 2 steps ahead, of what someone else is presumably going to do in reaction to your actions. That's game theory. Part of it is also neocolonialism. Colonialism is a fact. Many of the islands in the Caribbean have experienced colonialism. What has subsumed since the colonial experience is up for discussion. Is it post-colonialism? Is it neocolonialism? What is it? And we keep racking our brains trying to discuss and decide what is it that we are. There are issues of identity. High drama, rhetoric abounds, very strong words about who we are, about what we think about the metropole, what the metropole thinks about us. And then policies perhaps at a little bit more subdued level, where it's not that important to shout and trying to score points against the adversary, whoever that might be. And then we use data, statistical data, legal data, constitutional fine points to make our case. This is a typical scenario on the left. But there are other scenarios. And certainly there is a micro argument to be made here. It's based much more on commoner analysis, how people, at the chalk face feel about all this, how do they respond, if at all, because benign neglect is also a response. Sometimes people have had enough politics, so wherever they can escape politics, they do. Survival and benefit maximization strategies are also very important. As I will try to explain here, one of the expressions I like using in cases which involve subnational jurisdiction is having the cake and eating it too, having the best of both worlds, if possible. I think it's part of the strategy that people try to exploit and deploy. In the course of course, a period of time, you don't necessarily get all the eggs in line, all the ducks in line at the same time. You may have to be patient a little bit, work hard, and build towards a momentum to achieve what you wish to achieve. Some of it is going to be completely banal. Why should people talk about waking up in the morning and dragging a comb across your head if you have hair on your head? Right? But at the same time, let's remind ourselves, 99.9% of our lives is made up of the banal. And for those of you who are literature aficionados, I just remind you of Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, which is the story of the banal, a very common man on a very common day in a European capital. Right? And the banal is epic in its own way. Data is going to be different here. Data is much more going to be qualitative, experiential, sometimes autobiographical or biographical. You'll come across a lot of stuff written in the first person singular. It's still valid. If anything, research methodology today reminds us that writing in the first person singular is valid. Unlike how some of us were trained when we were younger. We always had to use the passive voice. Not anymore. So how does it feel to be governed on the ground? What do we have to keep in mind? Well, first of all, small jurisdictions. Part of the presentation today is about comparing small island developing states, places like Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, etc., with the subnational jurisdictions that are also quite plentiful in this part of the world. For one thing, the mean population of subnational jurisdictions is smaller than that of small island developing states. So even though SIDS, small island developing states, are already pretty small, when you look at the subnational family of islands, they're even smaller. You can see that, almost a third smaller when you look at the Caribbean and the Pacific. Typical size for a small island developing state in those two regions is just shy of 400,000. Whereas you look at the subnational version, it's 140,000. Land area is also smaller, again by a factor of 3 or 4. So it's not just less people, it's less people living on smaller pieces of land. So what does that mean? That means it's more intensive politics. There's a great book published last year, edited by Jack Corbett and Wouter Wienendaal. Wouter is from Holland. Jack is an Australian, currently working in Southampton, UK. And one of the conclusions of their study, it's a fantastic study of small states around the world, and one of their conclusions is what they call, and I quote, intense personalization. Intense personalization. Political system is made of people. It's not anonymous. It's not about parties and ideologies and, trends and so on. No, it's about him and her and what he's done, what she hasn't done, what he promised and she promised. It's all about that. It's already very intense in small states. Imagine in subnational jurisdictions where populations are smaller, land area is smaller, so people are living even more cheek by jowl than in small states. And the political architecture is not necessarily smaller, remember, right? So, in the same way that the proportion of elected deputies in Dominica has nothing to do with the proportion of elected deputies per voter in France, for example. In the same way, the elected representatives of a place like Aruba have nothing to do with the elected representatives of a place like Barbados. Right? So the smaller you go, the probability is, all things being equal, that an elected deputy is representing less people. You represent less people. It's the closest thing to a direct democracy that you can get, with all the pros and cons. You can't hide, for one thing. You take a decision, or you don't take a decision, everybody knows. And sometimes people don't forget, even though politicians might wish that people forget. It doesn't always happen. And Aruba is a case in point, 60,000 votes cast in the last election, 21 seats, 21 deputies in a land area of just 179 square kilometers. That's a high political density. But you're not alone, right? There are many similar situations. And it gets more complicated when you are members of federal units. Right? So you can have multi-tiered levels of governance, as I would imagine Aruba had when it was a member of the Netherlands Antilles, right? So you will have deputies possibly at a local level, a municipal level, then you have deputies at your island level, the country level, as you would call it. Then you would have had deputies at the regional level, not to mention, of course, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So it gets quite complicated. And how do you navigate all those levels? How do you get things done? How do you get everybody to agree on something? It's part of the game. And yes, so we look at the situation in this part of the world. One of the myths we need to dispel here is that a small island state and a subnational island jurisdiction are necessarily two very different things. No, it's not the case. Because as you can see on the right, there are subnational units that are members of small island states. Remember that. So we're not necessarily dealing with former colonial powers here, with European powers by and large, even though I've also added Colombia over there in relation to San Andres. It's not only that, but we also have a class of islands that live very close to other islands which are not necessarily much bigger than them, both in land area and population. And the dynamics are very different. In fact, there are secessionist or nationalist movements in all three of those islands. Nevis actually tried. Nevis has a constitutional backdoor. So if they manage to get 2/3 in favor of secession in a plebiscite, they can actually leave. It's in their constitution. And they did try in 1994, I think, sometime in the 90s or 98, and they failed by only about 20 votes. They got 66.2%. Imagine. So close. And why does that happen? I don't know. Perhaps there is a natural antipathy of islands sticking together. Perhaps there is a clear preference of islanders wanting to be governed directly by, a fairly rich, but also perhaps ideally distant. This is a question mark. I don't know. Would you rather have a distant patron than a close one? Who knows? Out of sight is out of mind. Is that helpful? I don't know. It works both ways. In the case of those islands, by the way, the image shows Nevis from St. Kitts. The islanders are, all the time very, very conscious of each other's presence. It doesn't necessarily happen in the case of, say, Mayotte and France, right? I'm sure Emmanuel Macron is not thinking of Mayotte all the time, right? So this is a situation that we need, I think, to keep in mind. As you can see on the left, there are quite a number of what I'm calling Class 1 subnational jurisdictions that have a direct relationship now with a metropolitan power. Of course, some of those examples would have been in the second column a few years ago. The Dutch Antilles itself would have been there. They would have been subject to Curaçao instead of The Hague, right? San Barthélemy would have been there. San Barthélemy would have been part of Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe, exactly. It's separated from Guadeloupe. Now it has a direct relationship with Paris. And, Anguilla as well. Anguilla in the 60s was supposed to form part of a tri-island country, St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla. But the Anguillans had other plans. And they managed to return to a colonial status. Imagine. So there are entities willing to forego independence for want of what they would consider perhaps to be a better, more stable relationship with another country. And this is the nature of life in a subnational jurisdiction. It's how to manage, how to exploit the advantages that come from being associated with another country, while minimizing the risks, as I will explain. The data speaks for itself. So when you look at life expectancy, infant mortality, economic measures of growth, of value added, employment levels, literacy rates, these tend to be much better in small jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions, than in small island states. So the practice is there. The evidence is definitely there. Moreover, the idea is that the metropolitan country will provide money, investment, funds, and expertise locally. It will make those transfers in order to permit its subnational unit to achieve and maintain a decent quality of life. That is the expectation. And it will invest, of course, in facilities that would be expected to be just as well as those that are provided to the metropole and in the metropole. Water treatment plants, hospitals, schools, universities, within the constraints, of course, of small size and scale. Those are the expectations. But that's not all. It's not just that. As we saw earlier with that KLM Boeing, it's also about the metropole making itself available. So the relationship is not just about a transfer of funds, not just financial. It's also about individuals in small jurisdictions having the right to seek employment, to seek education in their metropolitan country. Right? And this is a condition that's enjoyed by many subnational island jurisdictions, by the residents of those jurisdictions. Those transfers. Right of abode, employment, education, legal redress, in some cases even citizenship. The situation is mixed. Not all colonial powers will grant equal access to these rights. And certainly not in the case of one particular colony. Christian is an expert on the Indian Ocean. The British Indian Ocean Territory is probably the world's last created colony, created in the 1950s, quite urgently by the United Kingdom, as it was granting independence to its various former colonies. It sliced out a section of the Indian Ocean before giving independence to places like the Seychelles and Mauritius. And the BIOT is currently leased to the United States, where the United States has its largest military base outside the continental US, the base of Diego Garcia. The former residents, the citizens of these islands, were forcibly evicted, and their descendants, in most cases they are descendants now, have been fighting the courts over and over again, and most recently the International Court of Justice has again confirmed the decision of various other courts, saying that these individuals have the right of abode. They have the right to return home, because that is their home. We'll see what happens. So what are the concerns of these residents, these people who get up in the morning, comb their hair, and get on with their lives? Well, I think they are the concerns of all of us. They're individuals who want to benefit from high-quality resources and services. And ideally, of course, the first point where they would like those services and resources to be available is at home, right at their front door, wherever possible. But, well, is that always possible? This is a good question. The cost of providing a cardiologist, for example, in a place like Aruba, is probably going to be much more expensive per capita than providing that same service of a cardiologist in a place like Amsterdam. Reason being that the number of patients that this person might see might be few and far between. Not only that, but there will also be a lot of pressure on this specialist to generalize. Because not everybody is going to have a problem with the right artery. You might be a specialist on the right artery. What happens if you have a problem with the left artery? Do you need another specialist for that? Right? So the pressure to generalize, become a multifunctional specialist, as we call them, is huge in a small place. So what do? Plan B. Plan B is exile. Exile. You leave the island. Short term, long term. Temporarily, permanently. You're looking for something locally, it's not available, well, look for it somewhere else. If you need it that badly, you will consider leaving. Start a new life, perhaps. Depends how desperate you are to source that resource or that service. But there's a catch in all this. So even though we may crave to replicate many of the benefits that exist elsewhere, at the same time, there may also be a little resistance to some of those transfers. Issues of identity might come up here. Issues of tradition. Issues of even neocolonialism, at least in the rhetoric that is used. To what extent should we not just discourage in some cases, but to what extent should we allow our motherland to tell us what to do and how to do it? These are very serious issues in some cases, especially in a context with a long history of colonialism, as is the Caribbean. The world's oldest colonial playground, as it is sometimes called. So here we have a few examples of areas where these dynamics play out. One of them is education. So as I said earlier, There are expectations of good quality service here, but at the same time, one cannot replicate the range of specialisms, for example, the range of courses that are available in other countries, even the languages in which those courses are taught. And that creates then the vehicle for mobility, for individuals to go and secure their degrees somewhere else. Again, typically in the Netherlands in this case. With the risks that that kind of mobility brings along with it. Because once you taste the great expanse of the motherland and of Europe, well, one of the questions becomes then what happens after you graduate, right? How many people come back? How many people want to come back? That is part of the risk. Employment, same thing. For those interested in particular jobs, particular careers, for those of you who are not interested in working in tourism, for example, you're going to have a problem if you want to stay in Aruba, unless you create your own job or try to be entrepreneurial, come up with something else, right? Because the economy lacks diversification. This is one of the issues that I think is very much on the minds of the people that I've spoken to here, right? It all gravitates along one particular industry. 80% of your gross domestic product depends on one industry. That's a huge dependency. Health services. You have your hospitals, you have your clinics, I'm sure, your health your welfare system. At the same time, in some cases, it may be necessary either to get specialists flown in from somewhere else. Some islands have flying doctors or flying dentists, for example. But it may also be necessary to fly out the patient. We heard this morning from the Premier of St. Martin, the Prime Minister of St. Martin, that in the wake of the hurricane season of 2017, some of the kidney patients had to be flown out of St. Martin to Aruba. So yes, these things have to happen, and not necessarily because of hurricanes or disasters. There may be particular surgical interventions that may need to be carried out, not even in Aruba, they have to be carried out somewhere else. And the fourth area is connectivity. Again, this is extremely important. Connectivity is the blood of island life. It's all about the ability not just to be here, but to go somewhere else and come back, right? You look at an island, you look at a map of an island, but an island is not just that map. As you know, there are many places where there are more people living outside the island than on the island itself, right? There was a Danish anthropologist, what was her name? Karen Olwig. And she was researching the US Virgin Islands. She was doing anthropological research in St. Thomas, I believe. Very soon after she arrived there, she realized she had to go to New York. It was impossible to understand the community living in St. Thomas without also looking at the diaspora living in New York City. And I think this probably is the case with many small jurisdictions, right? It is certainly the case with many small island states who have kept their relationship with their former colonial power, but it's an even stronger bond in the case of subnational island jurisdictions, where the relationship continues to exist, is a statutory fact. And islanders do complain, sometimes vociferously. Bermuda comes to mind, for example, about how, on one hand, there is a tendency for the carriers of the European countries to have monopoly on certain routes. So if you're living in Bermuda, want to go to London, probably you have to choose British Airways, or British Airways. Take your pick to fly to London, right? And people will complain if the flight is late, if the flight is not of good quality, if the cost of the ticket is phenomenal. Again, you know, monopoly. So price control has to happen in other ways, not necessarily determined by market forces. Regularity is important. If you have a merchandise economy, you're trying to export stuff, being able to predict when the stuff is leaving the island, when the raw material is arriving to the island and so on, it's going to be very important. So connectivity is heart and soul of island life. And there are other examples, of course, about other practices. Let's be a little euphemistic about it, that are felt sometimes to be an imposition. We are here in a region that has different attitudes to homosexuality, for example. I know that Aruba is one of the countries that is very progressive, again reflecting, of course, the situation in the Netherlands, which has been one of the earliest countries to legalize same-sex marriage, for example, as well. But the region has different attitudes. So the British, for example, British overseas territories are less disposed to welcoming these kinds of, what shall we call them? Obligations that are sometimes felt as an imposition, as a neo-colonial imposition. The colonial power, flexing its muscle and dictating what should happen. This is the case in a number of areas. This is just one example. And we've also heard again in the course of this conference another way in which the relationship between the island and the metropole is tested in the context of what happens when a disaster strikes. That's Hurricane Irma, 6 September 2017. That was an ominous month for the Caribbean. Many jurisdictions in the Caribbean felt the wrath of this Hurricane Plus event, Class 5 plus event. In some cases, of course, if you have an island state, a country like Dominica, it is expected to fend for itself. It will, of course, try to source assistance internationally, but no country has an obligation to help Dominica. It's a sovereign state. There you are. That is the price of sovereignty. You're in control, for better or for worse. You may try to pull the strings, the heartstrings of, for example, the former colonial power, but the colonial power has no obligation to help out. Places, however, like Martinique, like Saba, like the US Virgin Islands, immediately after the event, they received pledges of support from the respective heads of state. President Macron, Prime Minister Rutte, President Trump, they all made the right noises. And in some cases, I think the only head of state that didn't actually come to the Caribbean at the time was Theresa May. I think she was busy with something else. She still is. But otherwise, if I'm not mistaken, all three heads of state actually visited their respective territories, pledging financial aid, pledging military support in some cases, medical supplies, food, water, etc. And then when the support, even though it may be pledged, when the support doesn't come, or comes too late, or is bodged, as has happened in Puerto Rico, right? Then the response, of course, is even worse. Because it's not just about pledges, it's also about you not honoring your pledges. And we've heard a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue to hear a lot about Puerto Rico, the world's largest subnational island jurisdiction by population, almost 4 million people, right? Ending up at the wrong end of the stick when it came to recovery, post-hurricane recovery. Something that I understand is still going on. In the meantime, so those are Class 1 SNIJs. By the way, subnational island jurisdiction, we like to call it SNIJ. For want of a better word. Barbuda, as we said earlier, Barbuda is logged in a tight embrace with Antigua. even though Barbuda has very particular land tenure arrangements. And it seems that when the whole island was knocked down flat by the hurricane, and the islanders had to be evacuated and sent to Antigua, of course. The Antiguans maneuvered something through their parliament whereby a huge hotel investment is suddenly going to land in Barbuda. And it's being hailed as the salvation to the Barbudan economy. But of course, the Barbudans are smelling a rat. And they don't like this idea because suddenly, somebody's going to have private property on their island for the first time. And they're calling this disaster capitalism. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this. So as you can see, same region, the same climatic event, being with responses that are very, very different from each other, based also on the jurisdiction that we are dealing with and the type of jurisdiction. So this is my last slide. And of course, I'll be welcoming questions after I finish. I would summarize perhaps the presentation by saying that the key feature of SNIJs, the residents of SNIJs, people who live in SNIJs, is trans-territorial mobility. This is the key to their survival. This is the key to they maximizing their choices, their options in the course of months, years, sometimes intergenerationally as well. Sometimes individuals will not be able to succeed in their dreams, but perhaps their children will, with the right investment and the right preparation. So SNIJ residents are strategically kinetic. I hope you like that phrase. I'm using kinetic in the sense intended by Mimi Scheller. Some of you may know her. She's an American anthropologist. She's written a lot about disaster capitalism as well in places like Haiti, for instance. Today, you judge people not necessarily by their wealth, but also by their ability to move. It's a marker. How quickly can you move? And do you own your own means of transport to be able to move? And how easily can you move your money? It's all about movement, mobility. And also circular mobility. So we're not necessarily living at a time when the decision to leave was a decision for permanent exile. It's no longer the case. The revolution in jet travel, low-cost airlines, etc. It has made traveling a much more democratic option. So many people travel these days. They travel they travel more for shorter trips. And it's factored in as part of their lives. Sometimes it's like going shopping downtown. You board a plane and you go for a weekend somewhere. You come back. It's part of your life. So in the case of SNIJ residents, my argument is that this trans-territorial mobility is practiced particularly in relation to one place. And this is the metropole. This is the place about which you will write a lot of songs. It's the place about which you will write a lot of political pamphlets. It's the place that will inspire a lot of novels. And it will also inspire a lot of soul-searching questions that have no answer. Questions about identity. Who are we? To what extent are we European, or American, or Latin American, or Dutch? And what does being Dutch mean? If you go to a place like Mariehamn, how many of you have been to the Åland Islands between Sweden and Finland? It's a jurisdiction, it's an autonomous jurisdiction. It has 27,000 people, so smaller than Aruba. But one of the conditions for being a resident of Åland is that you have to speak Swedish. And this has been the case since 1920. So guess what? The Åland Islands are the most Swedish part of the world. You go to Sweden, there are many people who don't speak Swedish in Sweden. But you go to Åland in Finland, it's surreal, because it's frozen in time and space, because of its constitutional arrangement. So, this is some of the realities that we're facing with, right? Issues of identity. We have heard over and over again how proud you are of being a community of over 100+ nationalities in this small island. It's great. I've been amazed also at the ability of switching languages, sometimes in the course of the same sentence. It's phenomenal. Unbelievable. It's great. So in a way, you may be representing a type of society that we all need desperately. Permanent relocation, if necessary, yes. People sometimes do pack their bags and go and live somewhere else. However, at the same time, they will usually continue to protest lack of autonomy. You can always ask for more autonomy, but not necessarily independence, please. That may come later in due course, but not now. We prefer to wait. And I will conclude with a little story here. You may have heard of this. When Suriname was making preparations to achieve full independence in 1975, I am told that the Premier of Suriname at the time, Henk Aron, contacted his counterpart in the Dutch Antilles, Joanco Everts, and asked him, hey guy, I'm going to become independent. Why don't you join me? I'm sure that if you applied, Holland would be very happy to let you go. And the answer was, if you allow yourself to be hanged, it does not mean I will do the same. So there you are, a very strong negative assessment of the perils of independence. And again, this is something to keep in mind. Many small jurisdictions are not keen on becoming independent. Of course, there are jurisdictions that still feel subject to a colonial experience. If you go and ask people in Bougainville, presumably many of them will argue that, yes, they are keen on independence from Papua New Guinea. Half the people of Scotland almost voted for independence not so long ago from the UK. So these are very strong feelings. And of course, what's happening in Catalonia. And we haven't heard the end of Catalonia. Right. So the question of independence will remain. However, independence is also a status that you can't return from. I don't think there is a jurisdiction that has become independent and then said, okay, hold on, I think I made a mistake. Can I come back, please? I don't think that can happen. So this is a point of no return. In the meantime, lots can happen. So the options between total dependency to almost complete sovereignty are huge. There are places in the Pacific, like the Cook Islands and Niue, for example, who already have the blessing of the United Nations, that if they applied to join the UN, these are not sovereign states. They are states in free association with New Zealand, and much smaller in population than Aruba, by the way. However, the United States has already told them, listen, if you wanted to, we can consider you as independent. But of course, there's a catch. You'll have to forego New Zealand, the New Zealand passport. And that's very important. So issues of mobility, I repeat, are I think very, very important. They are at the heart and soul of island life. They are also at the heart and soul probably of the reasons why some of these jurisdictions are not so keen on sovereignty. I think I will end here. I will end by expressing my sincere thanks to the organizers of this conference, His Excellency for honoring me with his presence tonight, distinguished guests, members of the public. I hope I have not offended you with my comments. As I said, I know very little about Aruba, but hopefully some of what I said makes sense and has made your evening worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you, Godfrey, for that wonderfully evocative, entertaining, and enlightening talk. As he mentioned, he is happy to take questions from the audience, and I think we have a microphone here, mostly for the benefit of people who are on our live stream audience so that they'll be able to hear. Any questions for Godfrey?
Guthrie, thank you so much. In Laurie's introduction, she mentioned that you were a rock star, and I've been a big fan for a long time. You mentioned that there was no territory that you can think that was independent and you just give it up. And there's one, Newfoundland. Give up independence.
I'm not so sure about Newfoundland. I was told that Newfoundland had dominion status.
Yes.
And then, opted to join Canada.
Yeah, it's actually.
So yes, perhaps that is the exception.
Yeah, give up responsible government for 15 years. That was just a little apartheid. Will you say that to what extent you can reach autonomy and it's not independence? Like, how far can you go, asking for more and more? Like, at some point, where does the metropole of the colonial power stop and say, well, listen, guys, this is it. Like, it's not going to change, You have to ask for independence. So to what extent small island jurisdiction can ask for more autonomy?
This is a very good question, and in a way I'm tempted to say, look at Aruba. Aruba went so far as saying, yes, I'm going to become independent. And then say, oh, hold on a moment. No, I think I changed my mind. Would that be a fair rendition of the history of Aruba? So it can really get as far as that, right? And there are also places that were slated for independence. So a place like Montserrat, for example, that back in the 1990s was on the way to becoming independent. And then, it actually joined the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States as a full member, and it still is. And then a volcano exploded, and everything changed. So yes, this is where you press. You see how hard you can press before the other side telling you, I'm going to call your bluff. Forget it. You're not going to get anything more from me. We heard an excellent presentation yesterday from Marcel Farinelli. He had to catch a plane, so he's not here, where he was talking about Corsica and the dance between the Corsican nationalists on one hand and the French government on the other hand. Remember, we're talking about a unitary state, which finds it very hard to accept, for example, that within its empire, there are other nations. No, there's only the French nation, by definition. So how do you integrate, how do you reconcile, accommodate Corsican nationalists in the fabric of a country that doesn't, by definition, doesn't accept separatism of any kind? And we've had violence episodes, peaceful episodes, changing status, more autonomy, less autonomy, the involvement of police, the army, they go back, they come back. It's part of the game. It's a tango, yes. And it takes two to tango.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by your speech, and I've gained a lot of insights from what you told us. I just have one question about the use of terminology. It might tap into the tango. You dance a tango with two adults. And the metaphors that are being used in talking about small island states and subnational island jurisdictions are often father, mother, child, metropole, periphery. Within the Caribbean discourse, this is very heavily under attack. And I support that approach, just like I support the not using SIDS, but using small island states, which you did in part of the presentation. Could you comment upon that opposition between those two?
Yes. Discourse is very important. So we have to be very careful about the words we use. Even the choice of a word small can be very problematic. In some cases, of course, countries strategically use the word small in order to achieve a particular international niche. A place like Singapore, for example, that doesn't have to fall within the family of small island developing states, still prefers to remain within the SIDS family because it has a role within SIDS. It's a place where people send citizens, workers to study, for example, to secure qualifications. So Singapore plays an almost a neo-colonial role within the family of small island developing states. The relationship between players is subject to considerable psychology. And I say psychology because it doesn't just depend on constitutional instruments, right? So, Malta was playing football against the Faroe Islands last week. So, on face value, Malta, 500,000 people, sovereign state. Faroe Islands, 50,000 people, not even a country. But hold on a moment, the players in the Faroese team, they play with respectable leagues in Europe. Some of their players play with the Danish series, in the league. Some of them play in the UK. Only one Maltese player plays overseas. And every time we played the Faroe Islands in the last 2 years, we either drew or lost. So the psychology was against us. Luckily for us, we won. Everybody was very happy in Malta. You know, a lot of people were finally very proud to be Maltese. We were actually leading the league, the division, for 2 days until we lost against Spain. But it's very psychological. So depending on how you behave, how you think you should behave, and of course the other player does exactly the same thing, right? I remember the first time I met a particular American professor who has written a very interesting book about small states and world markets, 1983. I won't call out his name. But as soon as he asked, where are you from? I told him Malta. Malta? Well, I felt like that. You know, this is an American professor. Okay, I'm from Malta, so what's that supposed to mean? Right? So, I hope that answers your question. We'll talk later. Christian.
Thank you very much, Godfrey, for your talk. We have chatted a bit in the last 2 days, and one thing that I'm trying to get a sense of is, so this success, maybe in many metrics of the non-independent islands against the independent one, is obvious, and it's about a few decades of different paths. But when I'm looking some islands, at least the one I know, I'm seeing that there's less money now and less support coming from their metropole.
Yes.
So are you seeing a shift or because obviously nothing is frozen.
Yes, that's a very important point. The climate for aid has changed. So internationally, not just in relation to subnational units, but even with sovereign states, the disposition of countries to help out other countries by sending them money, by throwing money at them, is no longer that popular, right? So much of aid is tied. And much of aid is today bilateral rather than multilateral, as it used to be in the past. Instead, what has happened, and again, going back to the mobility argument, is that where countries have had a shortfall of aid, government-to-government aid, they have seen some increases in remittances. Because there are more people, there are larger percentages of people out there that are working in countries where they were not born. I think the proportion at the moment is about 10% in the world, which is quite high. It's never been that high, right? So the modalities of aid have changed. You still get transfers, but these are now private transfers, household to household. And they're, of course, used for different reasons. So if government receives money from abroad, it could build a recycling plant, it could build a water purification plant, it could build a new hospital. If a household receives money from a brother, a sister working overseas, they're going to use the money differently. They may use the money to send somebody on a scholarship to study overseas. They may open up a small business, right? So, good question, thank you.
Very interesting discussion about islands. Let me just ask you to think about the next 50 years, the next 100 years. And do we need to redefine islands? Not simply a piece of land surrounded by water, but maybe primate cities, where there's such a thing distinction between the primate city and the rural areas or the smaller areas. I can think of Shanghai in China, Santiago in Chile, Rome in Italy. Many of these are islands too. And they have all kinds of legal, psychological issues about what their identity is with respect to this albatross of the surrounding space in the same physical space. So my question is, do you think about sort of the geopolitics of psychology of redefining islands? And what are some of your thoughts?
This is a good question, and it reminds us that not all islands are in tropical locations, not all islands are sparsely inhabited, not all islands have problems of depopulation. Some of them have exactly the opposite problems. Manhattan is an island. Stockholm is a group of islands, right? And we can go on and on. Copenhagen is on an island, etc. So there are many islands also that are effectively urbanized. They extend very often beyond their island shore to impose and impact on their respective contiguous mainlands. Singapore is another example of that, right? So this is also one of the realities of island life. There is of course, today a journal dedicated to this. There's a journal called Urban Island Studies, which was set up 3 years ago, focusing specifically on this point. I think that if we were to grossly generalize, there are 4 trajectories of island development. You say 50, 100 years from now. One of them is the city-state. So it's the urbanized island, it's Dubai, it's the Singapore, right? It's the Mauritius of the world, with a lot of technology, but also a lot of talented people. These will be cosmopolitan places, roping in talent from overseas. Perhaps it's the vocation of Aruba to become one of those places. That's one. There is the plantation economy. It is the island that continues to provide raw material, unprocessed very often raw material, for consumption and processing somewhere else. These are the islands that will continue to send tobacco, phosphate, bananas, nutmeg, sugar, right, to other places. The third is the fourth, right? No. Plantation, city-state. All right, we have the tourist economy. It's another particular island. It's a playground. It's a place where other people come to enjoy themselves while the locals work hard, so others can enjoy themselves. And finally, there's the nature reserve, where there's nobody, where everybody has left, because there's nothing to sustain a local economy. I think these are gross, they're ideal types, but they represent different trajectories of development. And they also indicate why populations may be growing or diminishing. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Babakino. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to speak on behalf, actually, of all the Dutch Leeward Islands and say that identity is something that we struggle with. So, I feel a little better about it, hearing that it's an issue in other SNIJs. For us, we are the least Dutch of all of the islands, and we speak English so much so that Saba and Statia have recently eliminated Dutch education, which is kind of crazy because they are municipalities of the Netherlands. So in speaking about identity, do you think that there is a solution to the identity issue in SNIJs, or is it that we just have to go independent and then we'll solve our identity problem?
I'm going to disappoint you by telling you it's a work in progress. I'm sure I will disappoint you by saying that. My wife has just completed a doctorate looking at early childhood education in small island states. And one of the fascinating areas, which is in a way a battleground of identity, is the early childhood education environment, right? So this is the first time that our kids find themselves outside the home in an environment where they're taken care of by others, not necessarily by their mother or their father. What is the language that is used in these centers? And, you know, there are 27 small island states with a population of less than 1 million. 20 of those 27 were former British colonies. In most cases, almost all, not all, but almost all of those, English is used in these places, even though it is not the language spoken at home. Is that good or bad? And what's preventing parents and educators from using multiple languages with young kids? Because after all, you know, it shouldn't make a big difference. Young kids absorb languages very well and very fast. There's no reason why a young kid cannot be taught 2 or 3 languages at a young age. But this, you know, this cuts at the heart of identity politics as well, right? What do we want our child to speak? In some cases, I know this is tragic, but I'm going to tell you. Parents will use their vernacular with each other so that their child cannot understand them. It's a tragedy. Sorry about that.
For coming, and do we rise for the, oh no, I guess Jim is going to come up here and finish this.
You can't keep an academic down.
That's right. A good man, academic.
I've never been accused of being a housekeeper as often as I have been the last couple of days. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, I wanted to thank the members of the general public from coming. I should have mentioned earlier that island studies, the characters associated with island studies are often, when they go to meetings, they don't go there as a troupe and enclose themselves and separate themselves from the rest of the public, the islanders themselves. They make it a concerted effort to bring the stories of the islanders there into those meetings. We may not have done as well as we could here, but this represents one way in which we try to hear from islanders here as well. So for those from the public of Aruba, we appreciate that you're here, and hopefully it's generated some conversations that can take place around your own dinner tables as well. There also, if you wish to, there's something that I tend not to know very much about myself, but there's a Twitter account, a hashtag called Island Stories. And so if you have any comments you want to make about the wonderful talk tonight, please go to that hashtag. Is that the right verb that I used there? And add something to it. Don't forget as well that we have another keynote tomorrow morning starting at 8:30. Dr. Peter Clegg from the University of the West of England is going to talk about Brexit and some of the implications potentially in terms of island-to-island relationships, depending on what might happen with Brexit. And with that, I'll also say goodbye to everybody and adieu.